The preservation of and increased access to the 92nd Street Y Humanities Audio Archives is generously funded by the National Endowment for the Humanities.
Let me say first a word about the title of these lectures, which is Humanist Psychoanalysis. I just want to explain that by this I do not refer to a special school of psychoanalysis, which is different from Freud psychoanalysis as, let us say, the Jungian or Adlerian or any other school is different. On the contrary, I not even would consider what I'm presenting here as revisionism. This is a word today very popular in the last few years in political circles when it is used with regard to Marxist theory, for the simple reason that science is always revisionist. It doesn't make any sense to talk about revisionism in science. It makes some sense to talk about it in politics, perhaps, because science revises itself constantly by finding new facts, by building new hypotheses on newly found facts, and also science, not within a few years, but within generations, revises itself constantly by a new cultural or philosophical climate, which is a concept which is a little difficult, perhaps. I shall come back to this later, but undoubtedly the climate of the 20th century, let us say of 1960, is quite different from the climate before the First World War in the 19th century. What the difference is, I probably shall have a chance to explain. Scientific procedure is always non-dogmatic. It is not a theory which is the banner of a movement, and it lacks the cult of personality. When you have dogma, when you have cult of personality, and when you have a movement, you may have something very pretty, but you don't have science. And I consider psychoanalysis a science, and therefore I do not believe that the question which is so often raised is valid, whether somebody is a Freudian or not a Freudian. I think the question is only whether he's a scientific analyst or dogmatist. And all I can say for the viewpoint I want to present here is that I believe it to be one scientific continuation of Freud, not necessarily the only one, but certainly not a dogma nor anything which makes a claim of saying anything final about these matters. Now you might ask why I use then, if all this is so, the word humanist as an adjective to psychoanalysis. Well, simply to indicate a particular emphasis which exists in what I have to say about analysis, but an emphasis which by no means is in contrast to Freud. Freud actually was a humanist in many aspects of his personality, in many aspects of his thinking, and what I'm trying to do is to emphasize this quality of humanism in Freud, and perhaps to enlarge it a little bit. I do this probably mainly for one reason, that today a renaissance of humanist thinking seems to me one of the most fruitful and one of the most important movements in the climate of today. You see it in Catholic circles, especially since Pope John. You see it in a number of Marxist circles, especially in the small socialist countries. You see it in great figures like Bertrand Russell or Albert Einstein or Schweitzer. And I think there is no doubt that in the last 10 years or 15 years, humanism as a movement has been the most important new element in the spirit of our times. Now, what I mean by humanism, I shall only express in a few words because I gave quite a few lectures about it some time ago, and I suspect there might be some of the audience here who attended these lectures, so I shall not try to bore them. Besides that, it is a little bit also marginal to the main topic of these lectures. I mean by humanism not what in one definition of humanism, for instance, one which is given by Professor Chris Teller, is meant, namely, the return to Greek and Roman learning, or the Latin and Greek language, which we find in the humanists of the Renaissance. I mean by humanism a much larger movement, or yes, here one can say movement really, which existed long before the Renaissance and existed long after the Renaissance. I would say its main elements are a certain view on man. Namely, it asserts the unity of man, it asserts the dignity and freedom of man, it asserts the perfectibility of man, not necessarily that man is good or that man will ever be perfect, but that he can perfect himself at least to a certain extent. It asserts that all of humanity is within ourselves, is within each of us, and this has a special relevance with regard to the concept of the unconscious. Because as I see it, what is really meant by the unconscious is that human experience which is common to all of us, while consciousness, and I shall talk about this at some detail later, is only that part of human experience which is permitted to become conscious in every given culture and society. So to become aware of our unconscious is really to become aware of our humanity. And I should like to add that humanism was characterized always by its ardent love for life and therefore by its ardent horror of war. At a period where now for the second time, Cuba was the first time, we are seriously confronted with the possibility of nuclear war. I think it is very important. It's almost impossible to talk about humanism or to use the word without at least mentioning this fact, that the Renaissance humanists tried to avoid the religious war, which in the 17th century came after all, and did a harm materially and psychically to Europe, from which some countries, especially Germany, perhaps never recovered. And we see today that the great humanists are the men who talk against fanaticism and for peace. That is to say, for life. Now, in this sense, Freud was a humanist too, although he was much more radical than his dogmatic followers often are. Now, you might raise at this point the question what the relationship of this kind of humanist interpretation or humanist emphasis on psychoanalysis is to what is often called existentialist psychoanalysis. Well, I shall say a few words about that in one of the next lectures when I talk about the concept of the passions of man, because there I shall have an occasion to talk what I mean by the conditions of human existence and their role for the understanding of the main passions of man. Now, the plan for these lectures is, as you have seen from the announcement, that I shall try to give 2 lectures on what is to me the most important and relevant topic of psychoanalysis, and that is the concept of the unconscious, of consciousness, of repression, and of making the unconscious conscious. There is really no word for this very interesting process, making the unconscious conscious. You can use the word, I have used it sometimes, de-repression, but that is a very poor word. It's a wonderful and most startling experience, and it's a pity to have no word for it. Or maybe it's a good thing, because otherwise everybody would talk about it rather than to have the experience. There is no doubt that the unconscious and repression is the central phenomenon with which Freud was concerned. I quote here one sentence from the history of the psychoanalytic movement, where he says, the theory of repression is a cornerstone on which the whole structure of psychoanalysis rests. There are other topics which I shall deal with in the course of these lectures. The passions of man in the sense of, as I see it, as against the Freudian explanation, the question of sexuality and eros, the question of the Oedipus complex and incest, and the question of the nature of neurosis and their cure. However, and I should like to make one comment, perhaps, that I'm concerned with the main discoveries of Freud. That is to say, which are the unconscious, which are the repression, which are the theater of passions, and not with a problem which has become so central in the development of classic analysis, namely the so-called ego psychology, where, as I see it, one has made quite a few discoveries which really, namely discovery that the ego has a much larger role in man than originally the Freudians had thought. But some of these discoveries are discoveries only for those who had not believed what was obvious anyway, namely that you cannot explain many phenomena of psychic life simply by the libido. And I find this not the most fortunate development of the Freudian theory, although I don't mean to deny that there are a number of fruitful ideas which have been developed. But I shall not talk about this, but about those points which were in the center of Freud's own theory and of Freud's own research. Now, today, I want to talk about the history of the whole concept of the unconscious, which is a very interesting one because it is actually rooted in two entirely different traditions. One tradition is, and that is a much more obvious one, the critical tradition of the Enlightenment philosophy, of Enlightenment thinking, of the new scientific thinking, let us say from the 17th century to this day. And the other tradition is the tradition of what you might call, very broadly, although not entirely accurately, the romantic philosophy or romantic thought, in which indeed the concept of the unconscious played a tremendous role long before Freud, but in a very different sense. And I shall try in the course of this lecture today to describe the two different concepts and their antecedents in the thinking and the thought of the Western world from in the last few hundred years. Now, at this point, I want to interrupt myself to say that while I cannot see the audience well enough to see how many chairs are empty, I was told that there are some empty chairs, and those who have no place to sit could come and use these chairs because some people who had tickets have not come. And I'll just stop for a minute until this process seems to be completed. Sir, could we still lower these lights? I see nothing. I see less than ever. Oh, more, yes. Yeah. Uh-huh. Well, that is it. Is that the best? Does this help you? Yes. That's all right. Well, yeah. Now let me first describe some of the main principles of Enlightenment thinking and how it is related to the discovery of the unconscious. You might say the Enlightenment thinking is characterized by the search for reality. Its question was, and this is a question which came up in the 16th, 17th century more and more, what is really real, as against what is only tradition, what are only dogmas which have been, and statements which have been repeated from century to century. The Enlightenment thinking wanted to know, or as its motto said, it dared to know what is really real, as against what is only apparent, what are only dogmas which we believe, but of which we don't know whether they describe anything which is really real. Now, that, of course, is the basic question of science, of the natural sciences. They ask what is really real. And if you take modern physics, well, it gives an answer which is by no means the end of physics, but which is describing somewhat better than physics 50 years ago described what is really real in matter. Unfortunately, the social sciences do not always describe or even try to describe what is really real, but they very often try only to give reasons to defend that which is real in the sense that it exists in society. But that's not our problem at the moment. You might also say the attitude or the spirit of enlightenment was the doubt of the obvious. The obvious was not taken anymore as something which you just accepted, but on the contrary, you doubted the obvious, you doubted almost everything. And the more so, the more obvious it seemed to be. And on the other hand, the Enlightenment was characterized by its faith in human reason. That man, by using his reason, can recognize more and more what is really real. And that this is the process of human thought. Not that one day it is revealed what is really real, but by applying reason to facts, by thinking critically, you make one step after the other and know more and more about what is really real. And what is characteristic for this thinking is also something else, although that develops, is in itself a process, a development, that is to assume more and more that there are forces which operate behind the phenomena which are apparently static and not changing. In other words, what is characteristic is the increase in the growth of a dynamic approach to reality, a dynamic approach in trying to know what is really real. Now, as I said, Enlightenment thinking doubted the obvious. It doubted everything. It first doubted the central place of the earth, which was for many centuries one of the most secure things for men, namely that the earth was the center of the universe. And first Copernicus and later Galilei discovered, or more properly speaking, rediscovered the fact that it was the earth which was moving around the sun and not the other way around. And Galilei almost came to discover the idea of universal forces, of a universal force of gravitation. So this was the doubt of the central place of the earth in the cosmos. The other doubt which began was a doubt of the existence of God, a doubt which also slowly grows, and you find in Spinoza, one of the most outstanding philosophers, who had this doubt and who expressed the doubt in a new form of a definition of God. In other words, there you find the phenomenon which is so frequent that a thinker, even a great genius, thinks in the categories of his time, and what is completely new, he puts into forms which are the forms of the traditional thinking. So Spinoza gives a definition of God which in effect says there is no God, and yet, formally speaking, it seems to be just another definition of God. But instead of that, Spinoza develops a theory of the human passions and a theory of how man is under the illusion of freedom because he's aware of his desires, but he's not aware of the motivations for his desires. And he was indeed the founder of scientific psychology. Then you have the doubt of individual identity. The question arises, who am I? Or how do I know that I am I? A question which necessarily had to arise after the end of the Middle Ages, where my identity was determined by my belonging to a group. In the Middle Ages, I was a peasant. I was a feudal lord. I was a burgher, an artisan. And this belonging to a specific group was my identity. After this world collapsed, after this social unity was destroyed, after the atomization of society, which became ever increasing, the question had to arise, who am I if I cannot be defined in terms of my group? And you all know the famous answer which Descartes gave to this question. He said, I am I because I think. The act of thinking, and that is, you might say at the same time, of consciousness, was a basis for my own sense of identity. In other words, the doubt of my identity was solved by my certainty that in as much as I am conscious of my thoughts, I am I. Another doubt was a doubt of the central place of man in the world of the living. And while man had always been supposed to be a special creature, just like the earth was the center of the world, man was the center of all living beings and made to rule them and to dominate them, the thought of Darwin removed this certainty. So man was part of an evolutionary process, and he was not anymore that distinguished being which was singled out. Another uncertainty arose with the theory of Marx, who showed why societies are not unchangeable, why they change in certain directions, rather than to have the belief which most sociologists before him had, although with certain exceptions, that a given society was something natural, that it was something enduring, that it represented human needs, and therefore it could be destroyed only by force from the outside. Marx showed that actually there were forces in society, namely essentially economic forces, the mode of production which created a certain practice of life, which are changing and which are responsible for the changes within culture, within society. And then as the last one of all these Enlightenment thinkers came Freud. And he raised another doubt about that which seemed the most certain thing in the world, and that is that the last psychic entity is my consciousness. This was almost as certain as 50 years ago physicists taught that the atom is a last entity of matter. I still learned that in school when my school teachers in 1914 or 15 had not yet heard about the latest development in physics. But until Freud, it was also, again with certain exceptions which I shall talk about in a moment, the general idea that the most certain things of our psyche is our consciousness. And then Freud comes and raises the same doubt which Copernicus, which Spinoza, which Descartes in a way, which Darwin, which Marx has raised and said, no, that isn't so at all. Your consciousness is, to a large extent, false consciousness. You are deceiving yourself. And besides that, besides the fact that what you are conscious of is mostly not even real, besides that, the most real thing in you are the things which you are not conscious of. So Freud continued the search for what is really real, and he found that most of our consciousness, most of our normal awareness is not really real. And that what is really real are things which we don't know. Now, there is nothing mysterious about that, and I hope you don't think when I use this formula, which is really real, there is any abstract philosophical principle involved here. It's very simple. If I, let us say, want to use a very banal example, if I have strong sadistic impulses and either torture my wife or my children in a sadistic way, and I'm convinced I do this because it's good for them, then what is really real is my sadism and not my reasoning, which I have in my mind, that I am filled with good intentions for their own sake. This is simply a fiction. Well, one could talk for hours about such examples, but I'm sure you know them. You know many of them, either from your experience or from what you have read about psychoanalysis. Actually, what Freud discovered was, if one changes an old sentence, man thinks, and not God, but the unconscious determines. And his conscious thought has relatively little reality to it. Now, so you see, Freud's discovery of the unconscious was really part of a whole trend which was a most characteristic trend for Western thought for 300 years, namely the search for reality, the doubt of the obvious. And it was, you might say, the completion, as far as we know now, and there may be many other things which will again be doubted 50 or 100 years from now, which to us still seem to be true. But up to now, it was perhaps a completion of this whole development in which the obvious was doubted, in which one destroyed the certainty about certain facts which we could rely on, and in which one was thinking in terms of forces which were working behind man's back, behind man's consciousness, and yet determining his will. And so it is perfectly correct to say that Freud was one of the great Enlightenment thinkers, and perhaps in a way the one who put the final stone on the building of the Enlightenment structure by his discoveries of the unconscious. But the interesting and less well-known or less observed fact is that there was an entirely different tradition, contrary to this one, which arrived at the concept of the unconscious. Now, this tradition, as I said, you may call it in a broad sense the Romantic tradition, the Romantic current, was a reaction precisely to the Enlightenment thinking in two important directions. The Enlightenment thinking, naturally, by its whole scientific bent, was putting much stress on thought and intellect, and very often forgot everything else in its emphasis on the importance of thought and intellect. Well, we all know that, although maybe we are not even aware of it, how in our culture today all the emphasis is on thought and intellect, on understanding things intellectually, even understanding things like Zen Buddhism intellectually, which by their very nature are not supposed to be understood intellectually, because we feel little and we think a lot. We don't think that much, but it remains we feel little. And what we do is mainly thinking. And in fact, there is a very interesting phenomenon which I wanted to mention right away. You can even think feelings. There have been very interesting experiments made in which, in experimental psychology, but you can see it also in clinical psychiatry, you can feel angry because you know in this situation you are supposed to be angry, but you don't feel angry. And, well, that isn't so bad if you don't feel angry and just show angry behavior. It's all in your mind that you feel angry. But what is not so simple is you think you love a concert, you love music, you love paintings, or you love a girl, or your wife, or your husband, as the case may be, and all that happens is you think you feel that, because you are supposed to be very exhilarated by, as the case may be, either Picasso or Rembrandt, and that is a matter of indoctrination. So some people are properly indoctrinated for Rembrandt, say this Rembrandt painting is so beautiful, and they think they feel it. But all that happens is they think a feeling. And people who are indoctrinated otherwise, and they are the more modern ones, think that these strange things which Picasso does on paper, on canvas, are beautiful. They don't feel anything either. Well, I had almost said it's easier not to feel anything with Picasso than with Rembrandt, but that is my old-fashioned way of looking at things. But nevertheless, the point is, you can have feelings which are in reality nothing but thoughts of feelings. And that results in that peculiar, flat, empty kind of feeling, which is consciously felt as a feeling, and it isn't at all. And one can also show that, for instance, nothing in the endocrinological or neurophysiological system goes on which would correspond to such pseudo feelings. But all that happens is one thinks one has that feeling. Now that is probably the explanation why so many people go to concerts and art galleries and read so many books, because our culture conditions them to think they feel something. And it's actually a matter of fashion, what they're supposed to feel. When real feeling today is very rare, because we live in a rather, to use a psychiatric term, schizoid culture in which one does not feel much. It isn't even good for one's advancement to feel much. If you feel much, you are somewhat unbalanced, and well, one is reminded of a famous sentence by Nietzsche that people who don't lose their minds over certain things have no mind to lose. Now, this is perhaps not so much true about the mind, although Nietzsche means it in a much broader sense. People who cannot feel strongly about certain things have just no feelings to feel. And that is part of our whole present situation. But I don't want to get lost in that. What I meant to emphasize was this romantic tendency was a reaction against the overemphasis of the intellect. It emphasized feeling, intuition, as against intellect. And secondly, it was a reaction against something which was also typical for modern thinking, namely put all the emphasis on the individual. Our whole modern epoch is an epoch of individualism. Well, it isn't anymore except in words right now, because well, if I could put it very oversimplifying, I would say where there's no privacy, there's no individualism. And we have very little privacy, really. And I don't mean that only physically, but mentally too. We talk a lot about individualism today, but actually this exists only in the Western movies or in politics, perhaps, where still you have a private entrepreneur who can, with a small capital, get up or down, as the case may be. But there's very little individualism in the big corporation and in society, which is patterned by the life of the big bureaucracy. But the tendency of the Romantic movement was one against individualism, not in the sense of the big corporation or the organization man, but in an entirely different sense, namely that one cannot separate the individual from the universe, from the cosmos, from the whole. That man was part of the universe, not only part of this earth, but part of the universe and all its forces. And that man, as seen by modern man, as isolated from it, as this one thing which has nothing to do with the whole of the cosmos, that was an artificiality. And in these two ways, this movement was a reaction, and in many ways a very justified reaction, to Enlightenment thinking, with its emphasis on thought, its emphasis on the individual, on the isolated individual, although actually, as it is easy to see, very often this Romantic thinking lends itself to very conservative and reactionary thinking, because it had the tendency of looking back to the Middle Ages and to the pre-scientific area as its model for overcoming these faults of Enlightenment thought. Now, you might say the roots, you might say that for this movement, it was not the individual, but life, which was the center of things. The concept of life played a tremendous role here. The life force, life as a whole, was a center and not the individual. The individual was only supposed to be one rather accidental manifestation of life. But you find that in Schelling, in Goethe, in Herder. But what interests us here is not this general philosophy, but where the concept of the unconscious comes in. And that is that you find in a number of these Romantic thinkers the concept that unconsciousness is the essential quality of life. That life, the life force, by its very nature, has a quality of the unconscious. And that consciousness is only a small cap, a thin layer put upon the basic things which is life and which is the unconscious. In other words, what you find here is the identification of the unconscious with life. Now, the greatest of all these thinkers, at least in my opinion, was a man who is very little known by the name Carl Gustav Carus. C-A-R-U-S. Carl Gustav Carus. He was a German professor of anatomy and began to think about these subjects only in his 50s and to write about it. And he wrote two very important books. One is called Psyche, P-S-Y-C-H-E, and the other one is called, in the German title, Symbolism of the Human Body, because he looked upon the human body as a symbol of the psyche, as an expression of what is the deeper reality in a given person. I tried to find out today, I arrived this morning here, whether the Psyche of Carus is available in English. And so far, without success. It seems it is at least not anymore if it was translated in English, it's not available anymore, but I shall try to make some more efforts, and I hope by next time I can tell you whether there is an English edition, at least in the library. I put so much emphasis on Caros because he is really, in the history of the concept of the unconscious, the most profound and most important thinker. He stated the soul is not identical with consciousness, as it was for the traditional Enlightenment thinking for Descartes and others. That the whole determines the parts. You find here in Caros already the principle of Gestalt philosophy very clearly expressed. The whole determines the parts. And that has a particular application if you think of what I said a minute ago, that the whole was a cosmos. The whole was not just one individual. And man is actually determined, according to Caros, by cosmic forces. Well, that may sound rather repulsive to many of you who are only thinking in terms of Enlightenment thought, and if not repulsive, rather silly to talk about cosmic forces which determine man. Well, I'm only reporting, although I must express my sympathy with Caros' thoughts, as you might have guessed anyway. Now, Caros begins his book, Psyche, with a most interesting sentence. The first sentence of this book is, "The key for the understanding conscious psychic life lies in the region of the unconscious." Now, that is a sentence which Freud could have written. The key for the understanding of conscious psychic life lies in the region of the unconscious. And it is very interesting that Freud could have written exactly the same sentence, and yet that these two men came from entirely different sources, and their whole philosophy, their whole concept of the unconscious was quite different, although again not entirely different. I shall say a few words about this in a minute. I should just like to acquaint you with some of Caros' main thoughts, which are indeed very interesting if one is interested in the whole problem of the unconscious. He said, and I quote, "Consciousness, which unfolds in its active response to external reality, takes the result of this activity down to the unconscious and thus modifies and changes it." Now, I should like to call your attention to the details of this sentence because it's a very crucial sentence in the theory of the unconscious. In the first place, he says that our consciousness unfolds in its active response to external reality. That is the way active response, the active is also very important, active response to external reality brings about the unfolding of our consciousness. Then this consciousness, as he says, takes the result of this activity, namely the active response to reality, down to the unconscious. It connects, in other words, the activity of our conscious mind with the unconscious, and thereby it modifies and changes the unconscious. Now you see here a very important thought. First, the emphasis on activity in thinking, and secondly, that reason or active thinking can modify the unconscious. He does not use a term which Freud would have used, perhaps, or many Freudians have used, that it controls the unconscious. It modifies it, it changes it. What Caros is talking about here is the interaction of an active consciousness with the unconscious, which has a function of modifying and changing the unconscious. Nevertheless, altogether, this sentence is also one which Freud could have written, namely the modifying influence of consciousness. What Caros emphasizes more than Freud is precisely the activity of the consciousness, that we must search, we must be active, rather than be informed or to get things into our mind, or with a shorter word, to be brainwashed, which is a large part of what our consciousness contains. I read you another formulation of Caros which says about the same. Consciousness making contact with the unconscious belongs to the heights of human perfection. In German, he expresses this making contact, I say it only for those who understand German, das Hinübergreifen aus dem Bewusstsein ins Unbewusste. Well, I translated it, I think, more or less correctly. Making contact, the consciousness making contact with the unconscious belongs to the heights of human perfection. Who would not be reminded in reading this sentence of Freud's famous sentence, where there is id, there should be ego. Where there is unconsciousness, there should be consciousness. This was Freud's ideal. And it was, as you can see from this quotation, also Caros' ideal. That it belongs to the perfection, to the heights of human perfection, which implies also it's relatively rare. But the task of man is really to develop his consciousness in the active response. The word response is also very important here. In the active response to the reality outside, and in this process, when his consciousness makes contact with the unconscious, man perfects himself. You see, this is not only a theory of the unconscious, but this is also, while not a theory of therapy, it is nevertheless a theory of human perfection. What ought man to do? What ought man to be striving for? The answer of Caros is develop his consciousness by an active response to reality. There's no obscurantism here, as you can clearly see. But then to be in touch with the unconscious. And if that happens, then man develops. Now, I should like just to quote one more sentence, which will startle you perhaps more than the two sentences which I quoted. And this sentence is, all knowing is to be conscious of the unconscious. All knowing is to become conscious of the unconscious. Now, as you know, the central idea of Freud was that for purposes of cure from mental sickness, one should become conscious of that which is unconscious. While Caros goes a great deal further here, and he says that all real knowledge is the uncovery of the unconscious. Now, this is not as strange as it may sound to some of you, because what it really means is we know only in as much as we purify our mind from the fictions, as much as we arrive at the reality which is more real than that which is usually in our mind. That the process of knowledge is not a process of information, not a process of knowing facts, but it is precisely, again, the same emphasis which I have mentioned before. It is activity. It is searching. It is penetrating. It is penetrating to the essence of a phenomenon. And if I penetrate to the essence of a phenomenon, then I make the unconscious conscious, because I see, this is just another way of putting it, I see something which I have not seen before because I was blind to it, because I wasn't fully awake, because I was under the influence of suggestions, of public opinion. And when I see it, when I see that which I haven't seen before because my eyes were not fully open, at this moment I can say, I know. For those of you who know Hebrew, I should like to mention that in Hebrew the concept of to know, for which there are quite a few words, which are expressed in the word yada, is precisely the same concept. The penetrating knowledge, and not intelligence. Not even the knowledge which can discern between this and that, but the knowledge which penetrates to the center. And the psychological process, and this is what Kairos is saying here, which leads to that knowledge is precisely to become conscious of the unconscious. That is to say, to see that which I haven't seen before. Now, you find a continuation of the concept of the unconscious in a philosopher who is perhaps more known than Kairos is, and that is von Hartmann, also a German philosopher, who wrote a book, The Psychology of the Unconscious, which was published in 1869, precisely the year in which Kairos died. Now, this is a much more romantic book. It's a very peculiar book, very much related to ideas of Schopenhauer, of a misunderstood Buddhism. I just mentioned to you one main thesis of the book, a rather metaphysical thesis, namely that reason and will both are unconscious, but they were separated by the fall of Adam and Eve. Reason and will were separated. And so since the fall, and that is man's curse, the will, which is in his terminology, which really means the passions, are irrational passions because they are separated from reason. And man's salvation will be when reason is liberated from the struggle with will and can be connected again, and then the world will be redeemed. But this liberated reason, and here comes Schopenhauer and the misunderstood Buddhism, this liberated reason will see that life is inevitably misery, and hence the world will relapse in nothingness. That is a very poor understanding of the Buddhist nirvana. I shall not enter into a discussion of this, but what is very interesting is that you find here already certain ideas which come out, or at least are related to Freud's later theory of the death instinct, namely on the nirvana principle, the life having the tendency to end up in death, in nothingness. If you read Hartmann and compared with Freud, you see here certain peculiar similarities which are not entirely incidental or accidental. I just should like to mention that in this tradition of the unconscious, you have Nietzsche. You have then a psychologist who was the founder of scientific graphology, Klages, a Swiss. You find certainly relationships here to the philosophy of Bergson, and you find a great deal of relationships to one of the most interesting figures in the history of psychoanalysis, a man who is very little known, namely Georg Grodek, also a German. Grodek really discovered psychoanalysis all by himself. He was a physician. He was the pupil of a very famous German physician, Schweninger, who was the personal physician of Bismarck. He opened up a sanitarium in Baden-Baden, in a German, very pretty spa, and suddenly he discovered that many of his patients suffered from things which were rooted in their unconscious. He became the founder of psychosomatic medicine. And he discovered the unconscious as the ruling power in life. He wrote to Freud very humbly and said that he had really, without knowing Freud, in fact he had written against Freud before, without knowing much of Freud, he discovered all this by himself, and he considered himself now his pupil. And all his life, not all his life, until a certain point at least, He tried very much to see Freud, to have the approval of Freud. He never got too much of this approval, and he saw Freud very rarely. But why I mention him here is that he put the word the id in the center of his system. His whole philosophy was just like Caro's. We are lived by the unconscious. And our consciousness is only this very small and insignificant thing. We are lived by the unconscious, and this he called the id. Everything. It may sound funny to you, but this was one of the things which Grodek would say, why do you wear glasses? Well, you would say you are short-sighted. Huh? You just want to hide. Well, this may sound perhaps naive. I'm not so sure whether it is, even though I wear glasses myself. He made many observations which one could not verify exactly in the clinic, which were guesses, which were intuitions. But he was really filled with the idea of the unconscious as life, exactly in the sense in which Caros was. So Grodek came from the tradition which has its deepest roots in Caros and in the philosophy behind Caros. And so Freud took his concept of the id when he developed this in his theoretical work after the First World War, what Freud called the metapsychology. And he took over Freud's concept, Grodek's concept of the id, and there the other tradition, namely the Romantic tradition, entered into Freud's system. Incidentally, a book has just been published recently. The author is Dr. Grossman and his wife. It's called The Wild Psychoanalyst. And it's published by Brasilia. It's a most interesting book for anyone who wants to know more about the history of psychoanalysis and who wants to know more about a man who, without any compromise, followed up one line, namely the line of everything is the unconscious, and not in the sense that the unconscious was irrational necessarily, but that the unconscious dictated us and how little is what we do with our consciousness. Grodek was, not strangely enough really, looked upon by most German psychoanalysts as a kind of a fool. He was by no means a fool. He was a most intelligent man. He was perhaps one of the most creative analysts, but he didn't go for the kind of Talmudic speculation in which you make theories about the mind and in which everything means the opposite of everything if it suits you, and if it doesn't suit you, it doesn't mean the opposite, in which you think a great deal about what your grandmother did to you when you were 3, and in which you have a whole case history of yourself developed in 3-4 years of analysis, which you can present within half an hour with a lot of speculation, with a great deal of thinking, little feeling. He was all this kind of theoretical abstract speculation was very foreign to Grodek, and so most psychoanalysts thought he was kind of naive. There were only a few exceptions of a few people I know who were not only terribly fond of Grodek as a man, but who were great admirers, and the most outstanding one perhaps was Ferenczi. Ferenczi admired him, Ferenczi loved him. I saw the two men together, and Ferenczi recognized Grodek's authority in this field of analysis. There were a few others, but very few. But if you have an occasion to read this book, you will read something very interesting. Now, at this point, I guess it's time to stop. I shall just in the next lecture speak 5 minutes more about where Freud was influenced both by the Enlightenment concept and in his later life by this Romantic concept, and where perhaps Grodek was precisely the link between the two. But that is for next time. We'll have now, as usual, 10 minutes intermission, and there will be cards available, and any questions you would like to raise, you can write on the cards, and I shall try to discuss as many as possible after 10 minutes. Thank you. Well, I have here a great number of very interesting questions. I couldn't even read them all, but I have read half, and I find them very interesting. And some of them refer to things about the nature of the unconscious, which I'm going to talk about the next time. What I really wanted to do today was something essentially historical, namely to show you the two sources of the unconscious in Western thought, how they differ, and how they look at how the whole problem of the discovery, of the uncovering of the unconscious comes from two entirely different views of life, from entirely different kinds of experiences. I shall speak, as I said, next time 5 minutes about where they meet in Freud. I took so much time for this because I think it is important, and not just an academic question, to be in touch with our past, with the tradition of our Western thought, because many things which are, many ideas are, make sense really only if we see them in the historical perspective. And if we forget the historical perspective, they become disrupted. Which reminds me that there was, and this is already the answer to one question here, and I actually had not time to mention it, and that is where Jung belongs into this whole development. Jung very definitely belongs to the romantic concept of the unconscious. For Jung, the unconscious was life, but it was also God, it was also the devil, it was the all-embracing power which governs us. To be in touch with the unconscious meant to be in touch with the creative forces in man. So in many ways, Jung is a direct descendant of Caros, of von Hartmann, and not at all the descendant of the Enlightenment philosophy of critical thought as Freud was. And it's one of the strange phenomena which sometimes happen, that these two men met and thought they were together when they were actually walking precisely in opposite directions. Only for a moment they met, and their meeting was a misunderstanding, really. Because for Jung, the unconscious was the admirable, the adorable, that which was the unconscious of a Caros, of a Hartmann. While for Freud, the unconscious was that which had to be uncovered in order to be destroyed or in order to be controlled. There was nothing, for Freud, there was nothing good in the unconscious in that sense in which it is for Jung. Now, there is a great difference, however, I must say, between Freud and between Jung and Caros, and that is that Caros was, as I said in the lecture, free from all obscurantism. I don't think that can be said for Jung. Caros was a man whose thinking was very close to that of Goethe. And in saying that, one says his thinking was clear, not mystifying, penetrating, while all this cannot be said for Jung. Jung's thought was usually not clear. It was mystifying. In fact, it's easier to understand Jung theory if you read a summary of one of his pupils than by reading his own books, because he was not critical of his own thought. His own thought tended to be romantic in a bad sense, of mixing up religious things with a very denial of religious values, of declaring the unconscious being identical with God and at the same time being a rather radical pagan. All this is not to be found in Kairos. Nevertheless, Jung was much closer to that general line of the unconscious, which goes from Kairos to von Hartmann, and quite in contrast to the Enlightenment line of Freud. And these two men had to clash, and they had to separate because, as I said, their very meeting was based on a misunderstanding. It is a peculiar thing, I shall talk about this next time, that they separated precisely at the time when Freud changed from the Enlightenment Freud somewhat in the direction of a romantic Freud. That is when he started his theory of the life and death instinct, where he developed many, I shall mention that briefly next time, concepts, emphasized concepts, which are much closer to the romantic concept than his earlier concepts were, namely really centered around biological concepts and life and death, rather than on the libido and the self-preservation. But it is very strange that precisely then Jung wanted to leave him, and Freud tried to hold him, although not consciously, although not successfully. That is also a slip, because I was thinking, indeed, that he made a great mistake in trying to hold him, and probably he was not aware of it. Now I come to some of the questions. If one is not aware of what is in the unconscious, how can he bring it into the conscious? Well, that of course is the great question, which is so difficult. There were in the past quite a few books by psychiatrists and psychologists who argued that psychoanalysis made no sense because it was based on a logical fallacy. If something is not conscious, how can it become conscious? So that's not possible, and that was the answer. Of course, things are not that simple, and they are just not so. I shall talk about that next time. What is this process in which I become aware of something which goes on in myself, in which I wake up to something which exists in myself, and in which I wake up to something which exists outside and to which I was blinded, to which I was not aware. In other words, I want to say this at least right here, that when we deal with making the unconscious conscious, we refer at the same time to experiences within ourselves and to perception of something which is outside, to which I have been blind, which however assumes that there must be one organ, call it intuition or anything else, in which I could have known something, had I not blinded myself to it. Well, but I shall discuss this next time. Here's a question. If the Enlightenment focused on the individual, does this mean that psychology is truly a product of the Enlightenment? Well, I think to some extent that is so. Of course, psychology has the interest in psychology has many roots. Psychology is very much rooted in a market economy. If you want to sell, if that becomes one central activity in the economic sphere, then you have to know your customer. Any good salesman is a very good psychologist, except his vision of man is rather narrow, because all he's interested in is only the question whether this person will buy or not buy, and what the best approach is to make him or her buy. He's not interested whether he's sad or happy, a good or evil, or whatever it may be. Therefore, it is a very narrow sector. Now, today, psychology has, as you all know, taken a tremendous leap into the field of what is called personal or human relations in industry. I understand it's more and more difficult to get a job in any big organization without going through tests which tell the boss something, or the organization something about your personality. Well, I wished somebody would raise the question even of the constitutionality of this procedure, because it's clearly an invasion of privacy, an illegitimate invasion of privacy, because you are forced, in order to make a living, to undergo processes which invade your privacy. If anyone has the opportunity and time to make this a legal issue, I would feel highly rewarded for giving this lecture. But people have become so accustomed to this kind of psychology that they don't even mind. They think this is just natural, that one is supposed to reveal what one doesn't know oneself to some young man who has studied psychological testing for a while, and that one is put in a situation which one even has less safeguards than a criminal has, who has an attorney for his defense, who has a right to appeal. But if in your test score appears that you are a psychopath, which may be based on many errors, or that you are a person not easy to get along with, which is worse, then there is no appeal, no defense, nothing. Well, and if this goes on, as it has been going on in the last few years, I think no one of us is sure anymore to be judged and to be followed by this judgment by methods which have their merits, but which I think should be applied only for the purpose of psychiatry and healing, where it is important for a psychiatrist to have many data on the patient. But they should be absolutely forbidden by law to be introduced in industry or in all spheres where a man doesn't come as a patient, but where he comes to have a job, which is quite something quite different. Was Freud at all influenced by the Marxist concept of level of consciousness? Or was this a late development of Marxist theory? No, it wasn't at all a late development of Marxist theory. I wrote a book on this, which I can... No, it hasn't appeared as a paperback, so I'm a little reluctant to recommend it, but still I started, so I shall. It's Beyond the Chains of... No, of course it has appeared as a paperback, so it's less than $1. It's called Beyond the Chains of Illusion, which I try to show the development of the concept of the unconscious in Marx, which he had long before Freud. Marx even used the word repression, in German Verdrängung. Rosa Luxemburg, the most gifted pupil of Marx probably, used the words the conscious and the unconscious quite explicitly. That was, however, in 1904. That was, but I don't think I don't know, she might have at that time taken them from Freud. But at any rate, Marx's concept of the unconscious comes long before Freud. It's in the 40s. Marx defined it in that way. He says, it is not consciousness which determines existence, but it is social existence which determines consciousness. Well, that is a formulation which is quite similar to what Freud could have said, except that what this really real is which determines consciousness was for Marx essentially the economic structure, the mode of production of a society, while for Freud it was a sexual impulse. Since I'm talking about it, I have to say it was for Marx not at all, as many people or most people believe, the drive for the instinct for more profit or for more material goods. This is completely an un-Marxian thought. On the contrary, Marx thought that wherever we find, as in modern society, that the most important passion of man is that for more money, more comforts, more commodities, that this drive itself is a result of a particular kind of economic structure and not its motive. Marx, you find in capitalism and older times, and especially now in the state capitalism of the Soviet Union, you find the dogma that the only incentive for creative work is money or material goods. This is common to Soviet thinking since Stalin, in fact. That's not an invention of Khrushchev, and to our capitalist thinking, except the people we in the West wouldn't express it any more so bluntly as the Russians do, and with so much vehemence. But it is precisely the opposite of Marx's thought, who felt and wrote that this formation of a powerful drive for money or material goods is precisely the result of certain social constellations. For those of you who are interested in the problem, I should like to mention the fact there's a very interesting book, The Myth of Karl Marx, by Turner, and he makes the same mistake of which so many people make. Otherwise, it's a very good book and a very interesting book, of ascribing to Marx the view that a certain impulse, that for material gain, is a motive, shapes society, and he makes this mistake by mistranslating the key sentence in Marx about, or one of the key sentences in Marx about this topic. Now, he didn't mistranslate intentionally. It's actually a sentence which is so difficult in German that if German isn't one's mother tongue, it is really almost unavoidable to misunderstand it because it's complicated. But that's the only possibility in which one can arrive at such a misinterpretation of Marx, if one reads Marx. Most people arrive at it without reading Marx. However, Freud was not influenced by Marxist thinking. In fact, I don't think he knew much about Marxism or Marx theory. I doubt that he had read Marx because one doesn't notice it. However, and he was in general rather, he was not fanatically against socialism, but he was very, very skeptical. But it's a very interesting thing that as a youth, when he graduated from high school, he was apparently, one of his best friends was one of the later leading Austrian socialists. Freud himself had the intention of studying law and to go into politics, and there is much reason to believe that at that time he was quite influenced by socialist thought, although not probably by particular knowledge of Marx. Incidentally, some of the writings of Marx in which these things become clear, his philosophical writings, were only discovered in 1932. So at that time, nobody even knew about them, and they were translated into English only a few years ago. Is the unconscious and the subconscious, are they identical terms? Well, Freud has used in the beginning a few times the word subconscious, but he changed it and never used it again. And it's very interesting why so many people use the word subconscious. You see, the subconscious is a place. So you have a nice picture. The subconscious is the cellar, and then comes the ego, that is the house, and then comes the superego, that is up there. But you can't speak of the unconscious as in the same way, or let me put it this way, you cannot say, I am subconscious of this and that, but you can say, I am unconscious of this and that. In other words, the unconscious leads itself to the use of what it really means, namely a quality of experience. I am unconscious of something. While subconscious is merely a place, the unconscious. But this, of course, is in line with a general tendency which occurs more and more as we go more to college, and that is the increasing use of nouns as against verbs. I'm sure those of you who have the disadvantage of being older will remember the times when you used more nouns and more verbs and less nouns. For instance, today you will find a person is prone to say, I have insomnia. He doesn't say, I cannot sleep. He has a lot of things. He has a car and a psychoanalyst and a problem, insomnia and kids. He has. And everything is in terms of what I have, instead of thinking in terms of a human function. I feel sad. People say, I have a problem. Well, if I have a problem, you have no problem, because you have got something. But all these are, of course, fictions, because there is no such thing as a problem. There is no such thing as insomnia. Insomnia is an abstraction. The only reality is I can't sleep and you can't sleep. Then we talk about something real. But if we talk about the insomnia which I have and you have, what is that? There is no such thing. It's the same thing with, let us say, if you take a word like freedom. There is no such thing as freedom. I can be free. I can be freer. I can emancipate myself. But to become freer is an expression of human activity. But freedom, the word freedom, is not a thing. It's only an abstraction which denotes the common element in that state of mind which is common to people who are in the process of freeing themselves. Of course, if you want to use it in another way, as our State Department does, that you call freedom, those people are allied with us, and non-freedom, those people who are not allied with us, then of course you better talk about freedom and not about the verb of freeing oneself, because I'm afraid that the present South Vietnamese wouldn't come out so well if we apply the verb to emancipate oneself. At least their government wouldn't. How is it possible to equate humanism with the unconscious when its essence is small compared to other basic drives? I'm sorry. I cannot quite read it. I don't want to lose the time now. I shall read all these questions until next time, because I think some of them are important, so that or quite a few are to deal with in the next lecture. So I keep this for next time. Can you further explain what you mean by a schizoid society? Well, can you further explain what you mean by a schizoid society? Well, naturally, the answer to this question, I would have to explain what one means by schizoid, which is the disposition, a characterological disposition, one might use it that way, which, if the person became severely ill, he would become schizophrenic. But schizoid is a temperament which in itself is not a mental sickness, but which is a disposition which in its deteriorated form would be schizophrenia. Now, if we say that one element which is important for schizophrenia would be the separation between thought and affect, that is to say that we think, but our thoughts have very little connection with our affects, well, then I think we are even a little more than schizoid if we think of the fact that we talk today. For instance, Mr. McNamara talked quite a few months ago about the fact that probably atomic nuclear war would lead to 120 million Americans killed. 120 million Americans killed in a few hours. Now, this is discussed without affect. This is printed, this is talked about, whether one takes that risk or whether our honor and this, that, and the other might make it necessary to take that risk. Now, I would say, if human beings talk about the death of more than half of the population, of not to speak of people who are called the enemies and people who are called the neutrals, when people speak about that without a deep sense of horror, without an affect of horror, just as one talks about some calculation, this to me sounds very sick indeed, because there you find thoughts as you would find it almost in a schizophrenic murderer who would kill somebody because he had just a thought, while there is no affect connected with it, and the affect in these cases usually would refrain him from the act of murder. It's an interesting thing, actually, to compare the style of a society with certain typical illnesses. The 19th century, you might say, had a hysterical style. It was a century with big orators of the love letters, with all the endearing words. And it was a century of hysteria as one of the most frequent and most innocent forms of mental sickness. Hysteria really meaning that feelings were expressed in a dramatic form, as Freud thought, and very often this was certainly the case, especially sexual feelings were dramatized and expressed in bodily forms. Well, today you say hi and goodbye, and there isn't much feeling expressed, either in love letters or anywhere else. You are very matter of fact, and hysteria has almost disappeared. Not entirely, but you find it more in backward countries than in most industrialized countries. Our style has become one of such matter-of-factness that we think clearly, but very much separated from feeling. And as I said before, not only separate, we feel little. And actually our thinking suffers from that separation, because if one doesn't feel, one's thinking becomes either shallow or very distorted, exactly as the thinking, if I may use that example again, that one can protect freedom by a nuclear destruction of the world. That thought is just nonsense, but it is possible as a thought only because the thought is completely uncontrolled by an affect. As a mere thought, one can think that. One doesn't recognize the fallacy of the thought because the thought is completely uncontrolled by human reality. It doesn't mean that people are cruel. It doesn't mean that people who think that thought are evil people. It just means that the thought has become so separated from feeling that there is no control, that there is no factor, no real factor which controls this thought, and therefore the thought can blossom like, as I said, in a paranoid system. The thought can blossom because there is no proper contact with feeling. One question was to repeat the title of the book which I was referring to. The title is The Wild Analyst. Why he's called the Wild Analyst, that you will find out from the book. I won't tell you here. And the name of the man about whom the book is, it's a biography of Grodek, G-R-O-D-D-E-C-K, George Grodek. And the publisher is Brasilia. Here's a question: can it be said that we are the life force, or the unconscious, knowing itself as us? Yes, that certainly can be said, and would be said probably by Kairos and by Grodek, I don't think that Freud would formulate it that way. Here's a question: wouldn't a person under the influence of liquor be his real self? No, you see, he wouldn't. We have to talk about this deals with something which I have to talk about next time. What we are concerned with here are two things. What is unconscious, and how do we become conscious of it, which are two different things. Now, for instance, you have, let us assume, a nasty alcoholic. That is to say, a person who, when he is not drunk, is quite nice because his whole security is based on being liked by everybody. So he's always nice, but when he's drunk, he gets really mean, which certainly cannot be said of all alcoholics, but there's one type who is like that. Then you can say his sadism, his vulgarity, his meanness, he is not even conscious to him when he is not drunk. Under the influence of liquor, his control disappears, and therefore other people recognize a reality in him which he is not aware of, and many others may not be aware of, when it is not covered by a pseudo-reality, namely the appearance he wants to give and the feelings he has learned to have. But actually, that is not, in the first place, all is unconscious. He may, for instance, and I shall talk about this next time, yes, he may show a deep sadism, but he may not show, under the influence of alcohol, something which is still deeper, namely that he is frightened. In other words, if you, under the influence of certain drugs, discover one layer of experience which is not open to inspection by others or by oneself under normal circumstances, that does not mean that you have penetrated to the deepest layers of that personality. And very often you will find that fright is much more covered than certain other phenomena, like, for instance, rage or even sadism or fury. But the other problem is that, of course, if he is drunk, he has no awareness of this. He has no awareness of his unconscious. Just as little as when we dream have we awareness that we are dreaming. And if you tell him later that he has behaved this way or that way, which you usually don't, except if you are married with him, then the man will quite innocently say that he doesn't remember, and he's a little embarrassed because consciously he goes on with his faked self, which is a self consisting of the feelings and attitudes which he wants other to accept as him. So the liquor isn't of too much help to discover the unconscious. It only helps for others to see the next layer, the most obvious layers, when the rationalizations somewhat are taken away by the liquor. I think it was Franz Alexander who once defined the superego as that psychic function which can be dissolved by liquor. Well, that is not too bad a definition, but it's not precisely only the superego which is dissolved. It's also that which we would call the ego, that attitude which consciously represents the person. Well, I think it is time to stop here, and as I said, I shall read these many questions in the meantime and shall try in my next lecture to take account of them in the lecture and possibly mention a few in the discussion afterwards. Thank you.
Thanks for listening. For more information on the 92nd Street Y, New York, and all of our programs, please visit us at 92ny.org.